Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I wanted to sit down and talk to you about my favourite books of 2021 because I read some really good books this year and I wanted to share that with you. I feel like this year I've really fallen back in love with reading again. I've always read throughout my life and I've always enjoyed reading, but this year I've really enjoyed it. I've really found that passion for it again. I think I read 44 books this year. And I feel like in these unprecedented times, books have been even more important for me. On the one hand, I read fiction and that serves as escapism and comfort and it helps me to feel calm. But also I read a lot of non-fiction, which makes me think and helps me learn about the world and challenges my ideas. And I think both of those things are really important at the moment with what we're going through in the world, and also as I am coming of age. I'm 22 and I'm thinking about what I want my role in this world to be and how I think about this world and etc, and books are an incredible way to broaden your horizons and also to bring you joy, both of which are so important. So without further ado, I'm going to open my Goodreads and I'm just going to go through my 2021 reading challenge list and talk to you about the books that I have loved this year. Also, I am planning on switching to the story graph because I've heard people say that's a better book social media and it seems to have a lot more stats, and also it's not owned by Amazon, but my perfectionist brain just wouldn't let me shift over halfway through the year, so I'm going to switch over for 2022. So I'll be using that in the future, but this year I did use Goodreads. So the first book that I want to talk to you about is Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer, and I think this was actually the very first book that I read this year. Jonathan Safran Foer is more commonly known for his fiction work, which I've actually not read that much of, and maybe I will in the future, but Eating Animals is actually a non-fiction book about veganism and whether it's right or not to eat animals. I myself eat a predominantly plant-based diet, and I put off reading this book for a while because I didn't think that there would be anything for me to learn from it because I already knew the arguments of why we should be eating less meat. But I'm really glad that I did read this for two reasons. Firstly, I liked how this book didn't feel judgmental at all about eating meat. I think Jonathan says that in the beginning that he's been vegetarian on and off throughout his life, and he wants to, come to some better answers or try and work out almost once or for all what the right thing to do is. And he almost talks about how he wants to eat meat and he wants to find ethical ways to eat meat. So he goes and visits organic free range farms and tries to investigate, is there an ethical way to eat meat? And he also talks so much about how meat is intertwined with our culture and with our traditions. For example, in the UK, we eat turkey at Christmas every year. And he was talking about how he's got some Jewish heritage and he wants to be able to cook these recipes that have been passed down throughout the family and sustain those traditions. And can we, and are we losing a piece of our heritage and our culture and our traditions if we give up eating meat? And I just love that so much because it really recognised how complicated this topic is and how much eating meat is entrenched in our society. And I think a lot of vegan media and propaganda, or whatever you want to call it, ignores that and puts it in the bin. But I think it was really nice of him to recognise that and to try and, find answers to what do we do about that. And then the second thing that I loved about this book was that it really felt like it left no stone unturned. He visited loads of different farms and different activists. He talked to people on both sides of the argument, people who work at sustainable farms, etc. And it really felt like he, explored every channel, and it really helps you to see the entire picture because he is leaving no stone unturned. And the spoiler alert is that at the end of this book, he does say that veganism is the ethical thing to do. And I think that the fact that he said that conclusion while also recognising all of the intricacies is what made this book so brilliant. And then following on from that, I then read We Are the Weather, also by Jonathan Safran Foer. And the reason I actually read these two books is because Lena Norms, who is one of my favourite YouTubers, constantly raves about this book called We Are the Weather. And so I was like, well, if she recommends it this much, it must be a good book because I love her and her channel and her book recommendations. So I decided to sit down and read these two books. We Are the Weather is about climate change, and it's about how eating less animal products is one of the best ways to reduce your carbon footprint, and about how that's often left out of the conversation. A lot of people, when they talk about climate change, don't bring this up because they're worried that they'll be attacked for it or that people won't want to hear it. But he talks about how, being vegan is one of the biggest things that you can do to reduce your carbon footprint, and about how if we want to prevent the climate crisis or to save ourselves from this climate crisis, we are going to have to eat less meat. But again, what's so good about this book is that he really recognises how intricate and complicated that is, because he understands how much eating meat is woven into our society and how complicated it will be for us to give up eating meat. And I think if I remember rightly, the conclusion that he comes to at the end of this book is that he suggests, we eat meat, I think once a day is what he says. He says if you don't want to give up meat, try just eating meat once a day. Don't have meat for breakfast, don't have it for lunch, just have it once a day. Or if you want to go further than that, just have meat on special occasions. Have it in your Sunday roast or, at Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever you celebrate. He talks about how we are going to have to reduce our meat intake if we want to prevent the climate crisis getting any worse, and how that's something that we shouldn't be denying, and how we need to be taking practical steps towards that, but at the same time recognising that it's hard for people to give up meat. And so that's why his suggestion is that we eat it far less often. And he talks a lot in this book about climate denial and about the reasons why we deny the climate. And it does go off on a lot of literary tangents, this book. So if you're into very literary reflective books, you would like this, but it's not as scientific and clearly laid out as Eating Animals is. Eating Animals felt a lot more like a typical non-fiction book. It follows a clear path, whereas We Are the Weather is a lot more like a literary, reflective, going off on tangents. He references Second World War a lot and the Holocaust because he is he's got Jewish heritage, as I said, and he talks about how people denied the Holocaust and about how we are now denying climate change, and he uses some examples from the World War II to show how, or to talk about that subject more. But yeah, it's a really difficult book to describe, but I would highly recommend both of those books. Next up, we have Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, which I read as part of trying to educate myself more about racism and race and politics. And I thought that this would be an interesting book to read, and I thought that it would go more than the surface level. I feel like I've read a couple of books over the last couple of years about racism that have almost disappointed me because they haven't gone below the surface. They basically just explain that racism exists, and so I thought that this would be a really interesting book to pick up. But actually this book was so much more than that. This book was one of those books where I read it and I was like, yeah, that was a good book, and I think I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads at the time, and then I have just not stopped thinking about this book ever since. So this book is about 2 things. It's firstly about why prisons are racist, and it talks about the history of prisons and how they evolved, and systemic racism in the prison society. It's specifically talking about America and the industrial prison complex, and how that's racist, but this obviously does apply throughout the world. And then secondly, it talks about the idea that prisons are inherently obsolete and unnecessary in our society, and why we have prisons in our society, and whether that's a good thing or not. And this just blew my mind. I've always felt very conflicted about the prison system in the world, because the system that we have essentially just punishes people for doing bad things, and I've always wondered, is that what we should be doing? And this book talks about how what's actually important, or what we should be focusing on, is firstly reparations for the victim, which doesn't really happen at the moment. If someone has a crime committed against them, there aren't really any reparations made by either the, criminal or the system. And secondly, we should be thinking about rehabilitation for the criminal or the person that's committed the crime. Because at the moment we send people to prison and they sit there for however many years, and then we release them back into society, and they are the same person, and often they're a worse person because they've been in this really difficult environment. Prison is not a fun place to be, and so often people come out of prison and they are more likely to commit crimes, or they've been stripped of their livelihood, they've lost their job, they've lost their housing, they've lost all their money, etc. And so they come out of prison and they're in this really bad situation. And why do we think that that's a good system? Prison abolition is a whole topic, and I'm not going to go into it in this video, but I highly recommend that book. It's just one of those books that just plants some seeds in your brain, Okay, so the next book that I want to talk about, and I think probably the only fiction book that's going to make this list, is Beartown by Fredrick Backman. This was actually lent to me by one of my friends. We were talking about books, and he was like, you have to read this book, it's one of my favourite books. But the way he pitched it to me is he was like, this is a really sad book, and it's going to break your heart, but in the best way. And I was like, sign me up, lend me this book. And that is true. It is a book about a small town in Sweden, I believe, that's kind of remote in the woods. It's a small suburban town where a lot of the men are really invested in ice hockey. That's the town sport. And then one of the star hockey players in the young team, I think he's 18, commits a crime, essentially, or he does, and the book is about that, but it's not really about that at all. What this book is about is just all of these different characters, and that was what I loved so much about this book, is that you really got into the heads of all of these different characters who are living in this town. And this book is about, the human condition and what it's like to live in a small town, and what it's like to feel isolated or to feel like your life is going nowhere. And it was just so beautifully written. It's a very sad book. I also highly recommend reading Trigger Warnings if you do want to read this, because it does talk about some violent crimes that could be really distressing for people to read if that's something that's triggering for you. So if you do want to read this, definitely check out the Trigger Warnings. But it's hard to say them without spoiling it. But if you want to have your heart broken, this is the book for you. I believe it is part of a trilogy. But at the end of the book, they basically allude to what's going to happen in the second book. And I was like, I can't read it. Like, that's going to be too sad. But I am definitely going to check out some other books by this author in the new year, because my friend who lent me this book said that his other book is nowhere near as depressing. And I was like, I would read that instead of the sequel. And then we have In Order to Live by Yomni Park. And to be honest, I think if I were to recommend one book on this list, it would be this. I think this is probably the most impactful book that I've read this year, and it's essentially an autobiography by a girl who was born in North Korea and how she escaped North Korea and what the story of her life has been like. I think she moved to China and then to Mongolia briefly and then to South Korea, and now I believe she lives in America. So she's moved all over the place, but it's essentially just an autobiography of her life. But I really fell down an autobiography hole, as you'll see from the next few recommendations at the end of this year, because I just think autobiographies are such a great way to learn about history, because they're so much more accessible and interesting, I find, than reading a history textbook. I want to learn more about the world and history and politics, etc., but I don't really enjoy studying history. Like, it's just not a topic that comes to my brain naturally. I'm an engineer and I love maths and physics, and history just doesn't sit in my brain very well. But I found that autobiographies are a great way for me to learn about the world, because they're interesting to read and they're often very accessible and easy to understand, but they also teach you about things that you don't know about. And so this book taught me so much about, the conflict between North and South Korea and what it's like to live in those places, and just really opens your mind up to what's going on in the world and really makes your own problems feel small. Not that your own problems aren't problems, but when you read books like this, you're like, yeah, my life is not too bad. But yeah, this book just really stuck with me because it taught me so much and it made me think so much, but it was also just well written and interesting and had a good pace, And yeah, I would highly recommend reading it if you want to learn more about the situation that's happening in North Korea, or if you just want to learn more about the world and what's going on in general. And then continuing with this autobiography trend, the other two autobiographies that I've read that I would really recommend are Born a Crime by Trevor Noah and Educated by Tara Westover. Starting with the Trevor Noah one, Trevor Noah was born in South Africa as a mixed race person at a time when it was illegal to have mixed race relationships, and therefore his identity, he kind of is like born a crime because he shouldn't exist because he is mixed race. And it's all about how he navigates living in South Africa and who he fits in with and who he doesn't fit in with and what his life is like. But also Trevor Noah is a famous stand-up comedian. That's how I've heard about him before. He's got some really great shows on Netflix. And so the book is funny and entertaining and well written because he is a comedian. So again, just a great way to learn about apartheid in South Africa in a way that's interesting and engaging. And then we have Educated by Tara Westover, which I feel like is a book that's been pitched kind of wrong, because I went into this book thinking that it was about a girl who is raised in a family that is very religious and that she sort of escapes from that and becomes educated and then becomes liberated. And while it kind of is about that, that isn't really what I took away from this book. She even says at the start of the book that this isn't really about religion. It's about her family in particular and her experience. And really, I found that this book was about mental health. She talks about how members of her family have these mental health issues. And to me, this book was about how that has this huge impact on the family. Like, one or two members of her family have these mental health problems, and the book shows you how that impacts the entire family and how it's impacted her life. And that was the thing that really stood out to me. And yeah, I can't really explain why I would recommend this book, because it was so heartbreaking and difficult to read, but it was just so interesting and engaging, and I really got hooked. I actually listened to all 3 of these autobiographies as audiobooks. I really prefer to listen to autobiographies rather than read them, just because I find that they have a much better pace and that they really seem to work in the audiobook format. And I just raced through this one because I was just absolutely hooked and wanted to know what happened, and I really felt like I was there. You know, it was just so well written. Okay, so those are the books that I absolutely loved and would highly recommend, but I also just want to whiz through this list and give some honourable mentions to books that I enjoyed, even if they weren't as groundbreaking or revolutionary as the ones I've just talked about. So firstly, I reread the Gallagher Girls series by Ali Carter this year. These books are middle grade, they're aimed at 12, 13-year-olds, but I just absolutely loved them. I raced through them. I really enjoyed the overall plot that arches throughout the books, and yeah, I read these over summer and I just raced through them, and they brought me a lot of joy, even though they are aimed at quite young people. The Flat Share is another very good easy to read escapism book. I reread The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. I didn't include that in this list because it was a reread, but that is one of my favourite books of all time. I would highly recommend it. I read The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green, which was a very interesting book, but again, I listened to it on an audiobook. It kind of felt more like listening to a podcast, but it was very interesting, I thought. The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. I think I gave this 4 stars. It didn't quite make my top list, but it was a good book to read. I read The Innovators by Walter Isaacson, which is a book that one of my friends bought for me. This book is a 500-page history of computing and software. And it was really interesting. If you're interested in engineering, I would highly recommend that book, but if you're not, then I probably wouldn't. I read This Is Not a Drill by Extinction Rebellion, which actually I thought was a very well laid out book, and taught me more about climate change and activism than I knew. I'm currently working my way through the Alumni series, which is a YA series of, I think I've got it here actually, this is one of them. It's these YA books, but so they're just easy to read, they're set in space, it's a good time, you know? I read Mind the Gap, which is the 3rd book in the Dash and Lily series. I absolutely love the first Dash and Lily book, and I've read it countless times. I read it most years for Christmas. It's become a bit of a tradition. The 2nd book, I have to admit, I don't really like. But then I saw that they'd written a 3rd book, and I actually really liked the 3rd book. I read it for the first time this year, and I really liked it. And then lastly, I finished reading yesterday Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, which, again, I can't really explain why I liked, but I got hooked. I was reading this book, and I was reading it a normal pace, and then it got to the end of part 1, and I was just absolutely hooked, and I raced through the second half of this book. I read, yesterday, I was listening to it as an audiobook, and I listened to half of this audiobook in one day. But yeah, I just absolutely hooked me. Would recommend as a holiday, fast-paced literary read, if that's what you're into. So yeah, those were the books that I loved in 2021. I also wanted to quickly mention, and I realised I didn't mention at the start of this video, is that I think about half of these books were audiobooks. I really love listening to audiobooks, and I find them so much easier to get through. And there's absolutely no shame or no cheating in listening to books rather than reading them. I would much rather put an audiobook on and sit down and do some colouring or painting than read a book. For some reason, that's just how my brain works, and that's been part of the reason I've been able to get through so many books this year. And also, as you saw in some of my honourable mentions, I love just reading YA trash, books that are just easy to read, just light-hearted romance. There is absolutely no shame in reading books that just bring you joy or are good escapism. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this list, and I hope that you found 1 or 2 recommendations that you might be adding to your TBR in 2022. If you read and loved any of the books that I've talked about, I would love to hear below in the comments. We can talk about it together, and I would also love to hear what your favourite book was that you read in 2021. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. My name is Louise, and if you want to learn more about me, the best place to find me is on Instagram and YouTube at Louise's Life. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon.